Well, it is wonderful to be here with you all, back in my home city. This congregation will always have a special place in my heart since it was actually responsible indirectly for launching my life in Unitarian Universalism. I grew up in Coppell and attended the Horizon UU Church as a kid. And I didn't realize it at the time, but that church was actually made possible by support and seed money from this congregation. If it hadn't been for Horizon, I doubt I would have found my way to divinity school or to the staff at UUSC, and I probably wouldn't be standing before you today. So thank you for making that possible. There's a passage in the New Testament that you may have heard. Jesus says, "Whoever tries to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life will preserve it." As with many things in that book, it's perhaps best not to take this too literally. Let's just say that Jesus seems to be saying something about fear and courage. He's saying that it is only when we are willing to risk what we hold dear, even our own lives, that we can preserve what really matters, and that we lose it when we act through fear of loss. Now, I happen to know something about fear. I am a fearful person. And as such, it seems to me rather unfair of Jesus to issue a warning to the fearful. We're not really the ones who need warning. We're already afraid. Over the course of my work with UUSC, however, I've begun to realize that Jesus may have had a point in this passage, which is what I want to talk to you about today. First, though, I'm afraid I may not have fully conveyed to you yet just how fearful I can be. I'm afraid of subways. I'm afraid of planes. I'm afraid that my cell phone battery will run out, and I'm utterly terrified of the possibility of a car tire being blown and being stranded somewhere in a strange city. So much so that I have come up with a new diagnosis for myself. I call it Psychosomatic Deflationary Syndrome. This is when I become so terrified at the possibility that I will have a flat tire that I convince myself that I do in fact have one. So I obtained a rental car here in Dallas this Friday and got on the highway hoping to see some of my childhood haunts out in Coppell. This was 2 days ago. And when, about 30 seconds after getting behind the wheel of a brand new rental, I felt ever so slight a tremor beneath me, I thought, no, Josh, you're just being paranoid. That's your psychosomatic deflationary syndrome kicking in. I drove on. The vibration of the steering wheel got worse. No, Josh, I thought, that can't be a flat tire. It would be too terrible and ridiculous for your worst fear to come true in the first 30 seconds of driving this rental car in the middle of a Dallas highway. The vibration turned into a steady rocking of the steering wheel. Then I heard the telltale flippity-floppity sound of completely busted and airless rubber. I finally pulled over. I found myself in an empty parking lot where they seemed to be demolishing some building behind me. What on earth do I do now, I thought. I couldn't possibly tell UUSC what had happened. Development would never invite me to anything again. I had just dealt some potentially expensive damage to a vehicle that had been rented for me, ideally in the hope that I would be using it to actually raise funds for the organization, not to deplete them horribly. I was at a loss. It was not the first time in my work with UUSC this past year that I felt this way, and it will probably not be the last. In a more serious way, work in the human rights movement often involves confronting one's worst fears. This is especially true in moments like the present. Many times this last year, we have felt as if we are confronting our nightmares come to life. Perhaps especially for people involved in the struggle for immigrant rights or refugee rights. We felt that everything that was once relatively safe, even the hard-won advances of the last few years, is now at risk. This previous summer, for instance, none of us yet knew what would be the fate of the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA, program, which enabled some 800,000 undocumented young people to live and work freely in this country. The incoming administration had not yet moved to cancel it, although they had announced plans to do so on the campaign trail. This inaction was grasped at as one of the few available straws of hope in the movement. Many people breathed a sigh that DACA, at least, might be safe. This began to change due to a letter dated June 29, 2017, sent by the Attorney General of this, my home state. Now, quick sidebar here, that I love this state. I grew up here, and my sister and I can both attest that you can't escape a Texas childhood without developing a fierce and irrational state pride. But seriously, they were not kidding when they said that everything is bigger in Texas. That can mean a bigger heart, like we see every day at UUSC in the work of our partners here in Texas, like Grassroots Leadership in Austin, or Raíces in San Antonio, which is currently helping people to complete their DACA renewal applications who were displaced by the Harvey hurricane. But it can also mean a bigger kind of nasty sometimes. In this June 29th letter, the Texas AG informed the White House that if they did not abolish the DACA program by September 5th, then Texas, along with 10 states, would sue to bring about this result. It was a devastatingly logical plan. By bringing the case in Texas, these AGs had almost guaranteed that the judge who'd hear it would be Andrew Hannon, who had put a similar initiative, DAPA, on hold in 2015. And if he did so again, the only hope for DACA would be a long litigation process, and we couldn't expect this White House to defend the program in court. The mood of fear and powerlessness was hard to escape. As the September 5th ultimatum drew closer, we at UUSC received a call to action from a coalition that included our partners at the UndocuBlack network. Led by the National Korean American Service and Educational Consortium, or NAKASEC, they had organized a 22-day non-stop vigil in front of the White House in the lead-up to the DACA deadline. They were asking allied organizations to adopt one of these 22 days to give their folks some relief. I was fired up to commit UUSC to hosting one of the vigil days. No sooner had I done so, however, than all my fears kicked into high gear. I was afraid of what would happen on September 5th. I was afraid of how we would find enough speakers. I was afraid of how we would fill 24 hours of nonstop vigiling. True, we had some ministers lined up to do readings, we'd collected solidarity statements, but the tone still felt mournful. I didn't know how to keep up our collective spirits. I was also, truth be told, afraid to confront an unfolding tragedy. Part of me wanted to avoid what now seemed an all but inevitable decision on September 5th. I didn't want to keep feeling powerlessness. I didn't want to see another wrenching setback. As soon as we arrived, however, I realized I had gotten it wrong. The vigil, which was led largely by Korean, American, and Latinx young people, many of whom had DACA status themselves, was in its 20th day by this point, with vigilers going nonstop 24 hours a day. I was expecting signs of exhaustion or at the very least of flagging energy, but no. The solution they had found was simple. The young people had set up an enormous speaker at the vigil site that was blasting multi-generational dance classics from I Will Survive to Despacito. We all swayed and jived and did line dances with our DACA signs for the next 72 hours, and we still didn't want to stop. In the end, I didn't have the heart to break it up for a reading of our solidarity statements. Apparently, it turned out, serious did not have to mean somber, and one could double down on joy in the face of tragedy. It was a small but important object lesson for me in the wisdom of UUSC's grassroots partnership model. These solutions arise from the people most directly impacted. I, coming down from Boston, had convinced myself that I needed to come up with new ways to fill the time or inject some new direction. I was forgetting what they teach you at day one at UUSC. Learn from the work already underway. Follow their lead on the ground and the answer will emerge. That is eye-to-eye partnership 101. So that was lesson number one for me, I guess, in the art of confronting fear. Know when to ask for help. Recognize that it is not always on you. This is the solution I eventually found to my highway flat tire problem as well. I called Kate Friedman, my colleague from UUSC, who is here today as well. Help, I said. I swear this kind of thing doesn't happen to me all the time, I said, thinking about the moose I almost hit on the road that one time and the flooding in my basement, and realizing that actually this kind of thing does happen to me all of the time. But Kate, it turns out, is the person you want to have in your corner when this sort of thing goes down. In no time, she had us behind the wheel of a new rental, with the car company apologizing to us for the flat tire. Often, when we approach a new challenge, many of us do just the opposite of asking for help. We assume at first that we need to be the ones to come up with a solution, especially if we feel we are coming from a place of relative privilege, as I often do. We may believe that it is our role to provide comfort or solace. After all, what right do we have to despair? That is a very isolating feeling. It's a huge load to take onto one's own shoulders to believe that oneself alone must know the answer, that oneself alone must be immune to grief. Inevitably, we come to be overwhelmed by the responsibility of this, and then we retreat in fear. We withdraw. But this withdrawal does not defeat fear. It makes it more powerful. By an irresistible logic, every time we give in to fear makes it harder to show courage the next time. This is what Norman Mailer refers to in one of his novels as the implacable law of fear. It has to be conquered, he writes, or it collects, then invades one's dreams. When we were driving back to the rental car place on Friday, I said to Kate, "Well, now I think I'm just cursed. Maybe I shouldn't try to drive here at all." She was having none of this. "You have to get back on the saddle," she said. "Go drive wherever you were planning to go before this flat tire happened." She was making sure that I didn't give in to the implacable law of fear. This, then, is lesson number two. You have to walk toward what you fear rather than away from it. You may think you can't because you assume that as soon as you do so, you'll be overwhelmed by fear, but it is actually, and paradoxically, in this moment that we find our courage. Back in December, our partners and allies again put out a call to come to D.C. DACA had long since been canceled, and Congress had dithered and punted and still failed to come up with a long-term solution for the 800,000 people whose lives had been thrown into turmoil. Since the last time, therefore, the situation had gotten even more dire. So our partners asked us to dare a little bit more. This time we were asked to stand in civil disobedience on the Capitol steps and risk arrest for blocking the way in order to send a message to our legislators that we needed permanent protections for members of our immigrant communities. Once again, I was afraid. I'd never been arrested or done civil disobedience before. All at once, I was confronted with just how much I dreaded the prospect of losing my freedom, if only for a few hours. I was aware then of the distance that lay between the ideals I had long expressed and actually trying to live them out. It has been clear throughout human history that resistance to injustice requires sacrifice. But I was realizing now how frightened I was at the reality of sacrifice. And then I thought, if I was this afraid, where would anyone else find the courage? After all, I was relatively insulated from the harm in the event of arrest compared to most of the folks actually leading this movement. I was not at risk of deportation. Somehow or other, I managed to get myself and my UUSC Science to DC there on the day of the action. As I palely waited for the instructions to start moving onto the Capitol steps, I realized that in my alarm, I had forgotten to eat breakfast. I was only able to keep on my two quivering legs by the well-timed provision of a bran muffin by one of my supervisors at UUSC, Meredith Larson. I here refer you back to Lesson 1 about asking for help. When we finally were seated on the Capitol steps, however, and the police were taking us into custody one by one, my fear evaporated. I realized that I was surrounded by hundreds of strong people who were putting themselves on the line, and that whatever was going to happen to me would happen to all of us together. I saw that once again I had gotten things backward. It's not distance from the struggle that gives you courage to sacrifice, but proximity to it. I could begin to understand why it is so often the people who have the most reason to fear who ultimately display the most courage. This is why Kate was not having me back out of the rental car. This is why as soon as I was actually pulled over on the side of the street this week and realizing my nightmare had come true, I was no longer afraid. The worst could come, and now I could focus on dealing with it. The most powerful fears by far in life are those felt in anticipation of disaster and vanish in the moment of distress. I have a partial theory for why this is so. Withdrawal from the struggle yields an exaggerated fear of loss. When we are too ensconced in privilege or security, we start to harbor illusions of immortality. We think we can preserve everything so long as we risk nothing. But when we are confronted each day by the reality of loss, when we see firsthand the evanescence of things, we value all the more those people and principles that really count, and we become ready to sacrifice. That is the truth of the gospel saying with which we began. UUSC's partners around the world live in the presence of threatened losses of human rights every day. And for that reason, they show the ultimate courage. In Burma, our partners risk murder and torture from their own police and military for bringing humanitarian aid to IDP camps where Rohingya people are interned. Here in the United States, the Undocumented Black Network led this week a civil disobedience at Congress to demand a halt to escalating assaults on immigrant communities and for a Clean Dream Act. They faced arrest, as I had, except that they risked far more in doing so, because they did their action without the unearned protections in this society of a white skin and a U.S. passport. Those are two lessons, at least, that I have learned about fear from my time at UUSC. And I am applying these two lessons in coming before you today. First, I am asking for your help We cannot do this alone. When we retreat from one another, we do nothing except make ourselves more powerless and strengthen the forces we are trying to resist. So let's do this together. In preparation for coming to this service today, Kate pulled the numbers for us on how many people in this congregation are currently UUSC members. The answer is 39, which is great. For those 39 people, we thank you. But in a congregation with more than 1,000 people, I think we can do better. We will. We are only as mighty as the number of us who can join together. So I am asking you to become a member of UUSC today. You can see Kate or Lissa or myself after the service to find out how to do so. Second, I am asking you to resist the implacable law of fear. Get closer to the struggle. Take action on behalf of human rights. Join a justice education trip through the College of Social Justice. Walk into the struggle, and you may find hope. Walk into the fear, and you may find courage. I'll leave you with the words of the great human rights advocate, Archbishop Oscar Romero of El Salvador, commenting on the gospel verse with which we began. Every person ought to want to live intensely, Romero says. Many do not understand. They think the church should not be involved with such things. But to the contrary, you have just heard in the words of Jesus' gospel that one must not love oneself so much as to avoid getting involved in the risks of life that history demands of us, and that those who try to fend off the danger will lose themselves, while those who give themselves to the service of others will live. May it be so.